Let's start with the exam revision for Access. And what I'm going to do is I'll open up this file here, the questions for, or the sample question. Please don't go to the answers directly, right? You're basically just cheating yourself. If you go in through the questions, follow my video, then you shouldn't have any issues after that in terms of how to answer an exam question for Access, right? So here is the question, the Word document which they provide for you on the website. Now, with the details and so forth, I'm not actually going to read all of it for you, but the exam question here is in two parts. Question one is to draw an entity relationship diagram, and question two is to complete table design using your entity relationship diagram. So we'll fill in these tables here. So I'm actually not going to use this Word document. I'm going to go through a presentation format for you. So I've actually copied the relevant information here, which is this part here. So I'm just going to switch over to my presentation. Now, in the presentation itself, you can see what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to attempt to create an entity relationship diagram by the information given to us, right? So they're saying the Port Melbourne wholesale fish market will need to keep a database of orders for seafood that they receive from retailers, right? Now, an entity relationship diagram implies that we're looking for entities. In other words, usually what you'll find that they are the nouns within the text, right? And just by reading this thing here, we actually know that the first entity that we're really looking for is actually in the first sentence. They're both actually, but orders will be one entity that we're actually interested for. So you would draw a box, which is entity, which, remember, the entity then reflects back into a database as a table. So orders becomes an entity. But one thing that you should realize, you should have noticed, orders, right, plural, singular. So entities describe a particular entity, not a bunch of entities, right? So entities are always in singular form. So order is one of our entities, and obviously by reading this information we know that retailers is the other, right? So from our entity relationship diagram now, we've got the two entities drawn in. Notice retailers, plural, retailer, because the entity only describes a particular entity, not a bunch of entities, right? So the only thing missing in this entity diagram now is the relationship with its cardinality, right? And we're given in the question, if you've still got the Word document open, it says each seafood retailer, so each retailer can place many orders for seafood, right? So in other words, what we're really looking for is a relationship between these two, and the cardinality will be each retailer, so one retailer can have many orders, and obviously what we'll see is the relationship is a one to many for orders. Now, don't get tricked by the questions, the exam question, because the second portion of the exam question says each order of seafood is placed in one retailer, right? And remember from our previous last week example, we ignore this many, and so we're reading backwards. We're saying each order can belong to one retailer, okay? So it's not a one-to-one, this is just reinforcing this one-to-many. So each retailer can have many orders, but each order can only belong to one retailer. So let's expand this exercise just a slight bit, which you don't do on a entity relationship diagram, but let's list where are the primary and foreign keys, just for instance rates, right? So if I do, if I want to have a look at all the entities, the entity can never exist without at least one primary key, right? So both of these entities will have a primary key, and what we've done is we've assigned primary key retailer ID, primary key order ID. Right? Now, where do the foreign keys exist? And if you remember from last week, the golden rule was the primary key becomes a foreign key on the many side of the relationship. So in other words, the primary key will be copied over to the order, and because it's on the many side, so we have primary key becomes a foreign key on the many side of the relationship. So just remember that for your primary and foreign keys. Now if I switch over to the Word document again, you see the second half of the question, or the second question is to populate tables. So what we want to do is actually create the next step, create the actual tables which are populated into a database from the entity relationship diagram, right? And what the question actually specifies is, what are the field names, where are the primary keys, and where are the foreign keys? You have to highlight them, right? So what are the actual fields within this, within the tables? And they're actually given to you in the question, right? So you'll actually see them here. You'll actually see retailer name and so forth. So in the presentation, I've actually copied it over for you. So if I go back here and I go to the next section, you notice that the attributes are actually given to you. So attributes in entities become fields within the database, right? So what are the actual tables that will exist within the database? And I've got the two tables here because obviously we've got the retailer and we've got the order, right? So remember, it says table name, so we have to highlight the table name, right? So the first one will be retailer. So we're taking these attributes, or the fields, and we're going to populate into our table. So the first one is name, right? Oh, sorry, go back. I shouldn't jump too quickly. Every entity or every table must have a unique identifier, and we know that that is the retailer ID, which we picked previously, and we highlighted here in the diagram as a PK, so it's a primary key, right? So every table must have at least one primary key. So now we can populate the fields, which is the name, and we know name, and we know here street address. I'm not going to say street address, I like to just put address. We don't like to have fields which have spaces and so forth in it, right? It causes problems later with coding. The other attribute or field will be suburb and postcode, and the last one given to us is the phone, right? Now the important thing about this exercise is you have to remember your data types. So what sort of data type can we make a primary key? So the primary key, immediately most of you are all probably yelling and screaming, saying that we can have an auto number. And you have to remember, auto number is the type where it's automatically controlled by the database. So it's incremented for us. We don't have to worry about numbers if we set it to an auto number, because every time we create a new retailer or enter data for a retailer, this field will actually be incremented for us. But alternatively, a primary key can also be a number, right? So just a straight number. But if we set it to number, then we have to somehow control the number so that it never duplicates. So we don't have number 2 twice. So we don't have the same code. And the next part, we can also set it as text as well. So we can have a primary key as a code, like CC534 or something like that. So it'll be text based. Right? So mind you, I've written down here the 3 different options with a slash divided by them, right? But remember, in the exam, you would have to only list one. So it can't be all 3. I'm just giving you an example to say it can be either one of these, like auto number, number, text. Name, obviously, will be text. Address, same thing, will be text, because we can put things in there like 285, something street or road, right? So we can mix numbers and letters together, so it'll be text. Same as suburb as well. Now here's the tricky bit, postcode. And if you remember previously, I hope you caught on from the last video, we would set postcode as text, not a number. Why is that? Right? Now, numbers are only used for calculations, and we're not going to use a postcode in a calculation. So we're not going to multiply 2 postcodes to get some value. Right? And the same deal goes with phone. we don't put phones as numbers, we put them as text, right? And the reason is because we can have formatting, right? So we can have like 3-digit, 4-digit, 4-digit, whatever formatting, which means that we are going to include things like brackets and spaces and so forth. So in other words, text, right? So there is our retailer ready to be put into the database, right? So now let's have a look at the second table, and we're given the parameters for that as well. And remember, our second table was called order, and order will contain quantity. Oh, sorry, same deal again, I just missed it. Every entity must have a primary key. So immediately first field will be order ID, and I've highlighted as a PK to say it is a primary key. So order will have a primary key, plus it will have quantity, right? So we'll put quantity, we've got a type, and we've got cost per kilo, and I'm going to cut this down so we don't have the space stuff, right? So I'm just going to say cost, right? Okay, now what are the data types? Primary key, as we covered before, could be auto number, text. So same deal here. We can actually have an auto number, we can have a number, and we can have text for a primary key. It's up to us to control the number and the text, but auto number is controlled by Microsoft Access, right? The actual DBMS. Now, quantity. Remember previously we had postcode, we set it text. Quantity, we know that quantity will most likely be in a calculation, so it should be set as a number type. Okay. Now, type, which means the description of this order, so it could be like, you know, fresh fish or trout or whatever. So, you know, it's text, and the last field, cost, will be a special number type called currency. Right? You could also set here number, but currency just adds that little bit of extra information where it'll convert our number and put in the dollar signs or whatever you've got, like euros or so forth. Right? Now, just to finish this these tables off, we know from previously that there was a relationship here with cardinality of one retailer could have many orders, which means to finish it off, the many side must have a foreign key. Remember the crow's feet. And the foreign key will have to be, remember the golden rule, the primary key of the one side becomes a foreign key on the many side. Right? So we just copy over retailer ID, the label for it, and we highlight it as FK for foreign key. Now, here's the tricky bit. What type do we set this foreign key? So if I have a retailer of auto number, do I set order as auto number? No, right? Reason is, if I create a retailer and I get ID 1 and then I place an order, I will get auto number as 1, right? Which means it'll enforce a 1-to-1, which means it only ever exists one order will only ever exist for one retailer. It can never be duplicated. So in other words, it's not auto number, but a number matches to an auto number, which means I can have a retailer ID here of 1, and then I can have many orders for that ID 1. I can say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 orders for ID of 1. Right? So it must be a number. Don't put auto number to auto number. It's not correct. Right? So if I have number, I know I can set number from what we just explained. And if I have text, I must have text. Right? So I can't match a number with text. They must be the same type. Right? So number, text, number, text. So that concludes that exam question for you. Right? I think there was one other thing here. If we have a look further down, there's question 1, question 2. If you keep going down, there's question 3 and 4, and it says, what does a form look like and what does a report look like? Don't bother. You already know a form, what a form looks like and what a report looks like. It won't be asked in the exam, so don't worry about that. Don't be concerned about it.